MO. It is towards the end of March, which means it's time for me to start my March TBR Tackle book. TBR Tackle is a super fun TBR busting game made up by Kieran at Katie Books, and the rules are very simple. You take 12 books at the beginning of the year, any 12 books off your TBR that you've been wanting to get to. Each month, Kieran has a bookish content creator help him make a prompt video that we follow to get each book. In January, the prompt had to do with Hadrian's Wall and the Berlin Wall. In February, the book bully switched up our total TBR and we had to follow her prompt that had to do with the number of pages. For March, Mina Reads switched up our TBR again, made us do quite a few arts and crafts, and then had us choose a totally different book. So you can watch how I chose my March book in my last TBR Tackle video, and I have a playlist on my channel, and I will also link everything in the description box below. But for March, I got The Third Life of Grange Copeland by Alice Walker. I've never read Alice Walker before, but she is most well known for The Color Purple, which was her most famous book. This is actually her first book, but not necessarily her debut novel. This book was written in 1970, but it wasn't published till years later. Now, I picked this up because I was interested in reading Alice Walker's work, and this was the Alice Walker book that I found in a free little library. I also really enjoyed the cover, and I love this edition, which is a London Women's Press edition, and it has these cool edges. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know what it was about. I didn't know that it was her first novel, and I just picked it up and put it on my TBR Tackle list. I have already started. I'm like 90 pages in, which is about a third of the book. So far, I'm really enjoying it. Like I said, I had no idea going into it what this book was going to be about. I haven't read any synopsis, but on the back, Alice Walker has a quote where she says, "I am committed to exploring the oppressions, the insanities, the loyalties, and the triumph of Black women." In The Third Life of Grange Copeland, ostensibly about a man and his son, it is the women and how they are treated that colors everything. I did read that before I started reading the book, so I had the idea that this would be following Grange and his son. The book actually starts with Brownfield, Grange's son, as the main character, and we follow him from boyhood when his cousins from the city come to visit Brownfield, Grange, and his mother on their plantation plot. So Grange works for a plantation. You aren't immediately aware of what time period this is, except that the cousins and aunt and uncle live in the city and presumably Chicago. They've moved up north to improve their potential for earning, to be able to have their own house, to be able to run their own business. And Grange is still stuck down south. Again, this book isn't rooted in time or place exactly, so you don't know exactly where he is or when in history this is. But it's pretty clear from the indications that this is after the time of slavery, but when Black men and women were still pretty much enslaved by white plantation and farm owners. Although technically Grange and his family are not slaves, they are indebted to the white landowners, and they are forced to do menial tasks. And one of the big things that Brownfield learns after his cousin and aunt and uncle have left is that Grange, his father, who is a strong and fierce man, is deathly afraid of the white farm owner. This is a lesson that Brownfield really takes to heart, and because he is already scared of his father, it's kind of that idea of, if this scary thing is scared, how scared should I be? We see that Grange, from this fear and guilt and inability to feel independent, takes it out on his family. He barely ever speaks to Brownfield. He ignores him except when to chastise him, and he beats Brownfield's mother pretty relentlessly. He's a heavy drinker, and the way that he copes with his depression and grief is to go into town every weekend, get totally drunk, take it out on his family, and then start a new work week. We see Brownfield learning these lessons from early childhood and as he's growing up. Circumstances lead Brownfield to be able to leave the farm and plantation. We see him wanting to travel north, wanting to go to Chicago or New York, to Harlem, wanting to improve his life and not end up like his father. Unfortunately, where we are in the book, Brownfield has ended up like his father, and he's taken on a lot of the same characteristics. He is a heavy drinker, he is a wife abuser, he is a child neglecter, and I wonder now where this is going to go, because Brownfield couldn't be more than 30 years old, and there's some circumstances that have brought not only the cyclical nature of Black oppression back onto him, but also some of his other past ghosts, let's say. I'm glad that I got this book for TBR Tackle a little bit later than February, because I read a lot of books in February about Black oppression and Black abuse, Black history of abuse in the South, and how that kind of translates today. I read a lot about the atrocities that Black women faced in the world and also at the hands of their men. It's a lot to read about. So I read like 3 or 4 books like that in January and February, and I was glad to kind of wait a little while to get into that story again. But there's also like an element of hopefulness in this book. And I don't know what's going to happen, but because it's called The Third Life of Grange Copeland, hopefully we will see Grange and Brownfield reunited. Hopefully we will see some redemption for these men. Maybe hopefully some realization of the causes and reasons for them to be abusive and destructive. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. I've only read like 1 book from each of these authors, but I've read Nella Larson, I've read Toni Morrison, I've read Gloria Naylor, and now I'm reading Alice Walker. And something that I think this book has illustrated now that I've read several Black women authors writing around the same time. In some ways, there are a lot of similarities in the writing style, in the topics, in the tone and subject matter of these books. All the books that I've read from these women. Nella Larson, I would say, is more of the outlier because she was writing more about cities and in a slightly different tone. But I feel like Gloria Naylor, Toni Morrison, and Alice Walker have very similar styles. I'm not saying that they're writing the same. I think they have distinctive voices, but I wonder if they're so reminiscent of each other because of the Black female experience. Having lived through the civil rights movement and some of the biggest civil rights movements, I wonder if it's because of a shared history, also a shared storytelling history. I think it's really interesting that the kind of plain, almost ugly language that's used is spun into very visceral, visual passages, very heart-wrenching, but also very stark. Probably Toni Morrison is the outlier there because her work is so poetic and beautiful and rich and lush, whereas I think Gloria Naylor and so far Alice Walker's work is a little bit more harsh, dry, bleak. I mean, Toni Morrison was bleak too. Nella Larson was bleak too. Does that happen with writers today? Are all those millennial books the woman experience that equivalent of today of some of this? I mean, obviously not in subject matter, but I just mean like those millennial writers who are writing about discontent, depressed, untethered young women, if you looked at all those together, would those feel as connected as these Black women writers from the 30s, 40s, and 50s? I don't know. I've never read those books, so I'm not sure. Those books do not appeal to me at all. These books do appeal to me. I do want to point out that later in the book, there is an indicator of what year this takes place in. I don't want to say what year it takes place in because I think that out of time element might be important, or at least as a reader, I thought it was interesting. When I read some more of this book, I'll let you know. getting very close to the end of March and I need to finish this book. I am on page 173. It definitely has been a little bit slow going for me because it is difficult subject matter. It is a lot about spousal abuse and child abuse and neglect. It is a lot about anger and violence. There is a lot of heart-wrenching parts and scenes in this book, so it does make it a bit difficult to get through. So I'm trying to think of ways that I can talk about it without really spoiling it. When I last talked to you, we were seeing Brownfield as he grew up, as he got married, and as he was unfortunately emulating his father in that he had become quite an alcoholic, heavy drinker, and that he took out a lot of his frustrations on his wife. And that later kind of translates to his children as well, just like it did with Grange and Brownfield himself. Although he started out very in love with his wife, and although he was learning from her a different path, he ended up taking the path that his father did of working for white farm owners and falling into debt, falling into a cycle of unhappiness and depression, drinking, beating his wife, neglecting his children, and seeking solace in the arms of other women. I also mentioned that this book had hopeful moments, and I think although Brownfield has abused his wife to the point of her being downtrodden, to the point of her being complacent in her abuse, she has hopes that she can still turn Brownfield around. Their children have hopes that they can move off of the farm and into a real house with working toilet. There is hope that there will be a reconciliation and a redemption for these people. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem like it's going to be the case for Brownfield. We also catch back up with Grange, and we see that although he hasn't changed much, he has had a lot happen in his life since he left Brownfield and Brownfield's mother, and how that has hardened him in some ways and softened him in some ways. I think this book is definitely a lot about that cyclical nature of abuse, that cyclical nature of oppression and depression, lack of financial freedom and lack of mental freedom, and the idea that once you're in that cycle, it's so very difficult to break out. I think some of the characters have become self-reflective and are thinking of how they got into that situation and how they can change that situation, or what aspects of that situation they could change, or what aspects they're willing to keep because of the alternative. Some of the characters have not had any self-reflection and not had any growth, seem to be going the other way. There is an underlying thread of manipulation, especially from these black men to their women, and there is an underlying theme of the powerlessness that these black men feel at the hands of white farm owners and the white nation, and is reclaimed by them by holding power over their wives, their women, and their children. So being helpless and being in debt on farms and being depressed and being oppressed by that situation has led them to force their women to feel this abuse and feel this neglect, and it's really taken out on the women. So I think the quote on the back of the book is really true, that although this book is ostensibly about these two men, it's really more about the women and how the women have to deal with what these men have become, and the loss of potential of what they could have been too. Because I think there was the potential for that cycle to end, and this book didn't do that. It's definitely very depressing. It's definitely bleak. It's definitely hard to read. As we're going now, it doesn't seem to be headed towards any good place. It doesn't seem to be headed towards any redemption for these men. It doesn't seem to be headed towards any redemption for these women. Some of them have already died because of this abuse. Some of them have already lost their livelihood, have already lost their will and their individuality. That is kind of very similar to Gloria Naylor's The Women of Brewster's Place. It's very similar to Sula in a lot of ways. It's very similar to Passing in some ways, in that idea that women have to suffer, do suffer, continue to suffer, and see no escape from suffering to a certain extent at the hands of Black men, at the hands of white society, at the hands of racism, at the hands of oppression. Although they are more prescient and more aware of what's happening to them and to their men, they're unable to break out of these cycles either. The men seem to be a little bit more unaware or less self-aware of the causes and effects that have happened and how they have the power within them to change these things. Whereas the women know the power that they have, and yet they're constantly being beat down, both literally and figuratively, and forced to participate in this terrible cycle and these terrible events. The oppression that they face at white society is only amplified by the oppression that they face of their husbands and the men in their lives, and yet that is something that they could control and break out of, and they don't. This is a time period where they couldn't become full citizens, where they couldn't go out and start their own businesses in most cases, and even when they do, they are on the fringes. But what they can change is who they associate with and how they live their lives, and the hope that they have placed on these men, these Black men. They could change that, but they don't. And that seems to be a very common theme in those writings, that resignation towards abuse and that resignation towards poverty. Whereas the men don't see a valid way of changing it, or they end up going back to it because it's comfortable in some ways. The women in this story see the potential, but are resigned to not allowing change to happen, or not encouraging change to happen in the way that it needs to. That being said, all those heavy topics and all that depressing subject matter and all that hard stuff, I really am enjoying the way that this book is written, and I love that very matter-of-fact, very plain, like I said earlier, almost ugly writing style that I have found in some of these books. The Women of Brewster Place might be a book that stays with me forever. Those horrible, dreadful scenes are more impactful because of the stark nature of the writing style. I only have about 70 pages left to go. In a few days, we will get the new prompt for TBR Tackle, so I'll probably catch up with you, give you a conclusion on this book, and we'll pick a new prompt when that video comes out. Hello, it is March. No, it's April 1st. That means it's time to watch Karen at Guidebook's new TBR Tackle video, which I'm very excited about. But I'm also very tired. Just got out of work. I'm gonna try not to take a nap, but I am gonna try and stay cozy for the rest of the evening. Before I pick my next TBR Tackle prompt, I have to talk about my end feelings of The Third Life of Grange Copeland. I finished this book a few days ago and I really enjoyed it. Super happy to have read Alice Walker's work. Super excited to read more Alice Walker. I do have one other Alice Walker on my TBR, not The Color Purple. I said a lot about this book already in this vlog and a lot of the themes in this book, but I think one of the themes that I really took away from the ending of this book was the idea of how you impact other people, whether you are meaning to or not, and that you can be aware of that fact or you can be oblivious to that fact. And sometimes people are oblivious to that fact because they're too wrapped up in themselves, and sometimes they are intentionally ignorant and willfully ignorant of that fact. So I think we have two men who at one point were young, bright, hopeful men. They became disillusioned and beat down by life. Although they originally loved their wives and loved their children, they used their downtroddenness and their depression as a excuse to take things out on their wives and children and other people in the town, their friends. And one of the reasons that they did this was because they felt powerless in their situations. So the idea is that you have an impact on other people's lives, whether you want to or not, but you can choose to have a positive impact on their lives. You can choose to want the best for them and want them to be in a better situation than you are, or you can drag them down to your level. You can beat them into the ugly, depressed state that you are in, literally or figuratively. And I think this book shows multiple examples of that. And the way that you choose what direction to go for hopefulness and betterment, or to go for bringing everyone down to how bad you feel, is by self-awareness. So if you pretend that your problems all come from external means, and if you pretend that you are not responsible for anything in life, then you're going to go down a negative path. But if you look within yourself and see the responsibility that you have towards others and see the responsibility you have in your own life, then you are more likely to go down a better path. Not an uplifting book, not a happy ending, but a very interesting read. This book took place over quite a number of years and several generations. This definitely is a generational saga, which I'm not usually into, but I really enjoyed here. And although this book starts out unrooted in time, it really starts to root itself. And I think maybe that was an intentional choice. So I think it was an interesting progression to kind of not know and have this amorphous, ubiquitous feeling in the beginning, and then to slowly come to the modern age, modern for this story, what was happening in the world. And I think through that kind of unacknowledged time to the very acknowledged time follows that progression of awareness and self-awareness. Let's watch Kieran's video and see what April's prompt is. Prompt number 4 is by Brandon's Bookshelf. Before we get into the video, I want to show you my remaining TBR Tackle books. And I have to tell you, I'm really hoping to get this book in May. Fingers crossed that we get this book in May and not now. Oh, a 10th book. Okay, hold on. Okay, so Brandon said, get your favorite book, and this is going to be a guidebook to the prom. If you have been on this channel for any amount of time, you know that my all-time favorite book is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. So here is a very weird copy that I got last summer. He said to see how many pages it is. In this edition, it is 180, and then find the book in your stack that has the closest number of pages. This one has 198. This one has 129. Coming in at 198, Funny in Farsi is the closest to 180. So we're going to put that aside. There's like 3 minutes left on this video. That was not so bad. Brendan said that the book that we picked out that was the closest in page number to our favorite book is the book we read for April, unless the page number was between 350 and 400 pages, which luckily mine was not. Or unless your favorite book falls into one of the 5 favorite books. And he listed them. It was like, I can't remember them already. Don Quixote, The Little Prince, Harry Potter, Tale of Two Cities, and one other book. Not to worry, not many people's favorite book is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So for our April pick, we will be reading Funny in Farsi. This is a memoir of growing up Iranian in America, and this is about a young woman who was born in Iran and then moved to, I think, California, to Southern California in the 70s. I am super interested in this though, because I don't know anything about Iranian culture. I don't know anything about about what it would be like to grow up Iranian in America, and I'm always down for some nonfiction, always down for a memoir. Super excited to have picked our April TBR Tackle book. When I start reading this, I will start a new TBR Tackle vlog. Don't forget, Kieran says it in this video, but even if you have not started your TBR Tackle, it's not too late. You can go back and start from January and do 12 books, or you can start this month with 9 books, or you can start next month with 8 books. If you are on the fence, I'm telling you, go do TBR Tackle. Let me know in the comments below what your TBR Tackle pick was for April, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!